For many years, Iran has defined itself in part by its opposition to my country. And there is, in fact, a tumultuous history between us.
به امریکایی‌ها و به متحدان اونها در منطقه من بگم که ملت بزرگ ایران هیچ گونه ناامنی و بحران رو در منطقه نمیپذیرد.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Sworn enemies standing on two sides of what seems like an unbridgeable divide, Iran and the United States. But believe it or not, the two adversaries were once strong allies. The alliance that lasted more than 3 decades ended with a dramatic coup, a hostage crisis, assassinations, sanctions, proxy wars, and more. Now, more than 40 years on, Iran and America's troubled relationship has been marred by distrust and violence for decades, with ripples that have reached far beyond the Middle East. So what shaped the feud between the two countries? How did Iran and the US become bitter rivals? In the early 1700s, Iran and the US had high cultural affinity and shared a mutual fascination. But in 1951, tensions between Iran and foreign powers influencing the country started to simmer. At the bottom of it all was the fight for oil. Iran has a rich history of resisting foreign domination. However, its location and its significant oil reserves made it irresistible to both the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. Although it was never directly under British or Russian rule, Iran signed a series of treaties with foreign powers that limited its sovereignty. In 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention, also known as the Convention of St. Petersburg, divided Iran into spheres of influence. Northern Iran was in the Russian sphere of influence and the southern part under British influence. British influence in Iran steadily increased. The Crown saw Iran as a key strategic and logistical link to its colonies in Asia, and a vital factor was Iran's oil reserves, which the British Empire controlled through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what is today known as British Petroleum. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister. Iranians were tired of foreign involvement in their affairs and wanted to regain control of their natural resources. Mossadegh introduced several reforms, the most significant one, nationalizing Iran's oil industry. This was a step too far for the British, who had until now controlled Iran's oil. London imposed an oil embargo on Iran. Iran turned to one of its strongest allies at the time, the US. Prime Minister Mossadegh wrote a letter to US President Dwight Eisenhower asking for help against the British embargo on Iranian oil and finances. Eisenhower refused to help. Just 3 weeks later, Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by Great Britain and the US, from whom he had expected help. The US at the time had its own Cold War calculations to make. Eisenhower feared the waning of British influence in Iran would leave the door wide open to the Russians and to the spread of communism, which the Americans were paranoid about. The CIA in fact played a direct role in the coup known as Operation Ajax. Along with the MI6, the CIA orchestrated a plan to remove Mossadegh from power and reinstate the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as a more reliable ally for Western interests.
In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government.
The Shah, now in charge of Iran, signed the Consortium Agreement of 1954, giving the US, British and French oil companies 40% ownership of Iran's nationalized oil industry for 25 years. It took more than 50 years for the CIA to publicly admit its involvement in this coup, an event that was instrumental in building anti-US sentiments in Iran. The CIA said, and I quote, "The military coup that overthrew Mossadegh and his National Front cabinet was carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy, conceived and approved at the highest levels of government." unquote. Declassified documents released in 2013 revealed the intricate details of how the US and the British worked together to remove an elected prime minister in a foreign country. Under Pahlavi, Iran became a close ally of the US. In the years following the 1953 coup, Iran was seen by many as America's regional proxy. Tehran became the largest purchaser of US military equipment in the early to mid-1970s, buying billions of dollars in military equipment.
We have faith in the word of the United States and their friendship.
We attach great importance to our relationship with Iran, as well as to the crucial role that Iran plays for the security and balance of this entire region.
In 1972, President Richard Nixon traveled to Iran to ask the Shah for help in protecting US security interests in the Middle East, including opposing a Soviet-allied Iraq. In return, Nixon offered that Iran could buy any non-nuclear weapon system that it wanted. But among the Iranian people, resentment was growing over foreign interference. Millions of Iranians saw the Shah as corrupt, dictatorial, and illegitimate. In 1979, he was forced to flee the country in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, when anti-American sentiment in Iran finally boiled over. Dissatisfaction among the merchant class, the Shia clergy and students was building up. Support was growing for Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shia religious leader living in exile in Paris. As the Iranian Revolution gained momentum, the Shah left the country on the 16th of January 1979 and Khomeini assumed control. On the 1st of April 1979, Iran was declared an Islamic Republic. The Shah meanwhile travelled to Egypt, Morocco, the Bahamas and Mexico before arriving in the United States on the 22nd of October 1979 for cancer treatment. The news that the Shah was in the US triggered a major backlash in Iran. On 4th November, an armed mob took 52 Americans hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran, demanding that Washington extradite the Shah. This hostage crisis dragged on for more than a year.
So it was November 4th, 1979, when the Islamic Republic of Iran stripped 52 Americans, their freedom, their dignity, and their pride. They brought Iranian women to the front door, then used them as shields as they broke through the American embassy.
During this time, Washington severed ties with Tehran, sanctioned Iranian oil imports, and froze Iranian assets. Finally, on the 21st of January 1981, the hostages were released under the Algiers Accords. As part of the accords, the United States promised not to intervene in Iranian politics, but the Iran-US relationship had already tanked. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, driven by fears of a Shiite revolt against Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. The US, which would launch a war in 2003 to depose Saddam Hussein, took his side in 1980 when he invaded Iran. The United States supported Iraq with economic aid, training and technology until the war ended in 1988. America's support came despite the CIA finding evidence that Iraqi forces used chemical weapons against Iranians. An estimated 1 million Iranians and 250,000 to 500,000 Iraqis died in the conflict. CIA documents declassified in 2013 showed that US intelligence officials helped Saddam Hussein gas Iranian troops in the later years of the war, despite America's knowledge that chemical weapons would be used. Covertly, though, President Ronald Reagan's administration was still in touch with Iran. Despite an embargo on selling weapons to Iran, Reagan approved a high-profit sale in hopes of facilitating the return of Americans held hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah. In 1983, amid Iraq's ongoing war with Iran, a suicide bomber hit a US Marine Corps barracks in the Lebanese capital of Beirut, killing 241 US military personnel. This was the highest single-day death toll for the US armed forces since the Tet Offensive of the Vietnam War. The bombing was claimed by Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Shiite Muslim militant group and political parties that continues to have strong influence in Lebanon. In the aftermath, the US State Department designated Iran a state sponsor of terrorism in 1984. In 1988, an Iranian passenger airline, Air Flight 655, was shot down by a US warship, killing all 290 passengers on board. The incident took place amid American and Iranian naval skirmishes in the Persian Gulf, and the US government called it an accident. Tehran still believes the shooting was intentional. US-Iran ties faced another major blow the same year when an Iranian mine nearly sank an American frigate in the Strait of Hormuz. This prompted the US Navy to launch a retaliatory campaign called Operation Praying Mantis. American forces destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms and sank a frigate.
They must know that we will protect our ships, and if they threaten us, they'll pay a price.
Evacuate the platform immediately. I repeat, evacuate immediately.
The US ramped up sanctions against Iran under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. In 1995, the White House expanded sanctions with a complete oil and trade embargo. The 1996 Iran and Libya Sanctions Act imposed an embargo on non-American companies investing more than $20 million per year in Iran's oil and gas sectors. In 2002, President Bush denounced Iran as part of an axis of evil with Iraq and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred.
In response, the Iranian government stopped secret meetings with US diplomats that were focused on capturing Al-Qaeda operatives and combating the Taliban. The United States killed Qasem Soleimani, commander of the IRGC's elite Quds force, with a drone strike in Baghdad in January 2020. Iran vowed revenge, calling Soleimani's death an act of international terrorism. And Tehran declared it would no longer commit to restrictions under the nuclear deal. In November 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was shot dead. Iran blamed Israel for Fakhrizadeh's killing. Many also pointed to the US. Iran's parliament vowed revenge and approved a bill to boost uranium enrichment to 20%, far beyond the concentrations permitted by the JCPOA. Washington's biggest fear is a nuclear-armed Iran. Intense diplomatic and deterrent efforts are in play from the American side, aimed at thwarting Tehran's nuclear advance. The Vienna Convention talks would not hold the significance that they do were it not for the deal Washington signed with Tehran in 1957. The 1957 cooperation concerning civil uses of atoms agreement between US and Iran was the genesis of the Atoms for Peace program. This program provided Iran with Western technology and resources that eventually became the foundation for its controversial nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program is the target of sharp criticism today from the US, but it was with the US help that Iran began developing in the 1970s. In 1967, the Shah established the Tehran Nuclear Research Center, or the TNRC, and Washington supplied Iran with a 5-megawatt nuclear research reactor, along with highly enriched uranium to fuel the reactor. The reactor at TNRC had the capability to produce up to 600 grams of plutonium per year in spent fuel. This collaboration continued until the  1979 revolution. 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 1979 Iran was one of the original 62 signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty that came into effect in 1970. The NPT banned countries other than the US, Russia, China, Britain and France from acquiring nuclear weapons. However, Tehran went ahead with developing its uranium enrichment facilities. In 2003, spurred by the US, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency said they had found traces of highly enriched uranium at a nuclear plant in Tehran. Tehran agreed to suspend production of enriched uranium and to allow stricter inspections of its nuclear sites until President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad rose to power. During a speech at the opening session of the UN General Assembly in 2007, Ahmadinejad called the dispute over Iran's nuclear program closed, but said his government would disregard Security Council resolutions calling on Iran to halt uranium enrichment.
Iran's possession of a nuclear weapon would be profoundly dangerous, not just to the United States, not just to Israel, but to the entire region and over time, the entire world.
In 2021, Iran claimed to have produced over 25 kilos of uranium enriched to 60% purity, which is just below bomb grade. Tehran also said it had acquired more than 210 kilos of uranium enriched to 20% purity. Some experts said that Iran was just weeks away from having enough material for a nuclear weapon. After years of negotiations with President Barack Obama's administration, 6 nations, including the US, Britain, France, Russia, China and Germany, reached a landmark agreement with Iran in 2015 to prevent Tehran from making nuclear weapons in exchange for lifting some of the most crippling sanctions imposed on Tehran. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was a huge breakthrough for the US and for Iran. But the US administration changed in 2016. President Donald Trump withdrew the US from the JCPOA in May 2018, despite no evidence that Iran was violating the agreement.
The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
The move shocked Washington's Western allies, and the tense US-Iran relationship became even worse. In April 2019, the US designated the primary arm of Iran's armed forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist organization. Just a month later, Iran declared it would increase enriched uranium production, rejecting its commitments under the nuclear accord.
ما در برجام توافق ما بر این بوده که غنیسازی در سطح 3/67 نگه داریم. از این اقدام خودداری میکنیم، یعنی سطحی دیگه برای ما مطرح نیست.
America will not be held hostage to nuclear blackmail.
America's closest ally in the Middle East region is Iran's biggest rival. Years ago, Iranian President Ahmadinejad alarmed Washington when he said that Israel must be wiped off the map. He called the Israeli government an illegal Zionist regime. Israel now sees Iran as an existential threat to the Jewish state.
From the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, from Tehran to Tartus, an Iranian curtain is descending across the Middle East. Iran spreads this curtain of tyranny and terror over Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere, and it pledges to extinguish the light of Israel.
Israel fears that if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, Tehran will use it to eliminate the Jewish state.
We have capabilities, and we are not afraid to use them. We will do whatever it takes. Iran will not get a nuclear weapon.
Since the 1980s, Iran has supported militant groups in the Palestinian territory, including Hamas. By the early 1990s, Iranian forces and Hezbollah were arming and training Hamas fighters in Lebanon. The recurrent fighting in Gaza has advanced Iran's aims of undermining the US and Israeli ties with Iran's Arab rivals, such as Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Over the past several decades, Iran has looked to grow its regional influence while exploiting the differences between the US and Israel. Iran has expanded its presence through its proxies in countries in the Middle East, a direct threat for the United States which has dominated the Gulf for years.
تلاش کرد که دو راهبرد رو دنبال کند. یک، منزوی کردن ایران اسلامی در جهان. دو، مأیوس کردن مردم در درون. و این دو راهبردش رو با فعالیت‌ها و کارهای دنبال کرد و در هر دو راهبردش شکست خورد. در بعد منزوی کردن ایران اسلامی موفق نشد.
In Iraq, Tehran built influence by affiliating itself with friendly Shiite groups following the 2003 overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Years later, in 2019, a US Army study on the Iraq War concluded that an emboldened and expansionist Iran appears to be the only victor in the conflict. Iran also gained a foothold in Syria by helping the Assad regime hold on to power amid an ongoing civil war. With Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, Iran has made itself a critical factor in Middle East politics. In 2023, Washington was shaken when Iran restored diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, 7 years after Riyadh and Tehran severed ties. This was at a time when Saudi Arabia, a key US ally, was repeatedly seen distancing itself from the US. The US may be losing its grip on the Middle East. And Iran, while assuming a greater regional role, may find that its bitter enmity with the US is a drawback when it comes to engaging with other countries whose support it needs. The shifting sands of the Middle East may yet turn enmity into engagement.